They laughed before I even sat down. Not cruel laughter, worse, the kind that assumes you don't matter enough to be careful with. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one at that table felt the need to hide anything from me. That was their first mistake. Before I go any further, let me say this. If you've ever been ignored, talked over, or treated like you were invisible just because of your age, you might want to stay with me. And if stories like this resonate with you, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. Some lessons don't come from being loud. They come from waiting long enough to be underestimated. The dinner was my uncle's idea. A family reconnect, he called it. One long table, too much food, forced smiles, and conversations that felt rehearsed. I took the seat I was given at the far end, near the corner, where the lighting was softer and the expectations were lower. That placement wasn't accidental. It never was. People talked over me easily. They always had. Someone asked me how school was going without waiting for an answer. Another relative joked about how quiet I'd become lately, like silence was something that happened to you instead of something you chose. I didn't correct them. The room smelled like roasted meat and expensive wine. Everyone else drank freely. I stuck to water and listened. That habit had started a while ago. Listening, I mean. When you stop trying to prove yourself, you hear things people don't think you're supposed to hear. The conversation drifted, as it always did, toward business. My uncle leaned back in his chair, confident, comfortable, enjoying the attention. He talked about deals he was handling, partnerships he was fixing, mistakes other people had made that he'd had to clean up. Names were mentioned, not carefully, not respectfully, just casually, like the people attached to them didn't matter. Someone across the table laughed and said, "You've always been the responsible one." I watched his face when they said it. He didn't smile right away. There was a flicker, something close to relief, maybe even validation. Then the smile came, practiced and smooth. I kept my eyes on my plate. At one point, my aunt glanced at me and said, "You're awfully quiet tonight." It wasn't concern, it was curiosity, like she was checking to see if I'd changed in a way that might inconvenience them. "I'm fine," I said. That answer satisfied her. Simple answers always did. The truth was, I wasn't there for the food or the company. I was there because a week earlier I'd learned something I wasn't supposed to, not from a message or a file or anything like that, from a conversation, a careless one, someone assuming I wasn't paying attention. That's the thing about secrets. They don't usually hide, they relax. As the plates were cleared, the tone shifted. Voices dropped slightly. The jokes became sharper. Someone brought up an issue that had been quietly causing tension in the family for months. Money had gone missing. Not stolen exactly, just redirected, explained away with confidence and timing. My uncle spoke before anyone else could. He always did. He blamed confusion, then poor communication, then other people's incompetence. Each explanation landed softly because it came from someone everyone trusted. He spoke calmly, like a teacher correcting students who should have known better. Heads nodded around the table. I noticed who didn't speak, who avoided eye contact, who stared at their hands a little too long. Silence tells its own story if you let it. Someone joked, "At least the kids don't have to worry about this stuff yet." A few people laughed again. I didn't. I realized then that they had already decided who I was in this story. The youngest, the observer, harmless, too inexperienced to connect dots, too quiet to challenge anything. That assumption had protected me more than they knew. Dessert was served. The conversation loosened. People relaxed. That's when the most honest things tend to surface. My uncle leaned closer to someone beside him and said something under his breath. Not quiet enough. I caught it. It wasn't a confession. It didn't need to be. It was a sentence built on certainty, on the belief that no one at that end of the table mattered. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not excitement. Clarity. This wasn't just about money or pride or being overlooked. It was about betrayal that had been happening in plain sight, about someone using trust like a shield and family like cover. I didn't speak up then. That wasn't the moment. Revenge doesn't work when it's rushed. It needs space, context, witnesses who don't realize they're watching. so I stayed quiet while the dinner wound down, while chairs scraped against the floor, while people hugged goodbye and promised to do this again soon. As we stood to leave, my uncle clapped a hand on my shoulder and said, "You'll understand all this one day." I looked up at him and nodded. He had no idea how close that day already was. On the drive home, the house felt unusually quiet. My parents didn't say much. They didn't need to. They'd sensed the tension too, even if they didn't know why. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, replaying the night piece by piece. The words, the looks, the confidence with which certain things had been said. I thought about how easy it had been for them to assume I didn't understand, how comfortable they'd felt rearranging the truth in front of me. That comfort was going to cost them. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I was done being used as background noise in a story that affected all of us. I didn't need to confront anyone, not yet. I needed to let people continue being exactly who they thought they were. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. Not a dramatic one, not something obvious, just a decision to stop stepping aside, to start paying closer attention to who said what and when, to notice patterns instead of excuses. At school, nothing looked different. Same halls, same routines, but I felt different, more present, less uncertain, like I'd finally understood where I stood, not at the edge, but somewhere much closer to the center than anyone realized. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from a family group chat. Someone had posted a follow-up about the dinner, lighthearted, jokes, no mention of the tension underneath. I read it and didn't respond, because sometimes the most effective move is letting people believe they still have control, right up until they don't. And as the days passed, I began to notice small shifts, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, calls that didn't include me anymore, plans discussed a little more carefully. It was subtle, but it was there. They were starting to sense something. They just didn't know what yet.
And that was exactly how I wanted it, as everything quietly moved toward the moment when pretending I was just a kid would no longer protect them at all. It didn't happen overnight. That's the part most people get wrong. They think revenge arrives loudly, in one clean moment, like a door being slammed. But the kind I was heading toward worked differently. It moved slowly, through habits and assumptions, through people repeating the same mistakes because no one had ever challenged them before. Family gatherings continued, smaller ones this time, casual lunches, short visits. I stayed the same version of myself I'd always been, polite, quiet, observant. I didn't insert opinions. I didn't ask questions that would raise suspicion. I let them talk. And they did. The more comfortable people feel, the less careful they become. My uncle, especially. He liked to explain things, to narrate situations as if he were the only one who understood how the world worked. He spoke about numbers and decisions with confidence, rarely stopping to consider who might be listening. I noticed something else too. Whenever certain topics came up, money, responsibilities, future plans, he always redirected the conversation away from specifics, toward generalities, toward blame. He never lied outright. He just shaped the truth until it looked harmless. Others followed his lead. I started keeping track, not in writing, not on my phone, just mentally. Who agreed too quickly, who avoided certain names, who stayed quiet when they should have spoken. Patterns emerge when you stopped excusing them. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Two relatives talking in the kitchen while they thought I was outside. My name came up, briefly, not with concern, but dismissal. "He's still young," one of them said. "He doesn't really get involved." That sentence stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed everything. They weren't hiding things from me because they were afraid. They were doing it because they didn't think I mattered enough to include. That belief was the foundation of everything that came next. A week later, my parents were asked to step into a conversation they hadn't expected, a casual one, framed as a check-in. My uncle wanted to clear up some misunderstandings. He spoke smoothly, reassuringly, explaining why certain decisions had been made without broader input. I watched from the side of the room, literally and figuratively. He didn't acknowledge me once. That was the moment I understood the depth of the betrayal. It wasn't just financial or procedural, it was personal.
He was confident he could shape reality without resistance because he believed no one would challenge him, not even family, especially not me. After that, things accelerated. Subtle changes became more obvious. Accounts were restructured, responsibilities shifted quietly, certain people gained influence they hadn't earned, others were edged out without explanation. Still, no one spoke openly about it. I stayed quiet. At school, I found myself thinking less about classes and more about behavior, about how people react when they think they're safe, about how authority works when it isn't questioned. I realized that the skills I was learning had nothing to do with textbooks. They had to do with patience. One evening, my uncle invited us over again. Just him, my aunt, my parents, and me. Smaller table, softer lighting. He poured drinks and smiled easily like everything was normal. This time, though, I noticed something new. He was careful. Not with me, but with my parents. He chose his words more precisely, paused before answering questions, avoided certain topics altogether. It was subtle, but it was there. He was adjusting. That told me something important. People who rely on control often feel it when that control starts to weaken. The dinner ended without incident. No revelations, no arguments, but as we were leaving, he looked at me for a moment longer than usual. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I met his eyes. "I'm listening." He laughed, but it wasn't the same kind of laugh as before. There was calculation behind it now. That night, I made a decision, not to confront him, not to expose anything publicly, but to stop protecting him with my silence. That didn't mean speaking out. It meant no longer filling gaps, no longer smoothing over discomfort, no longer pretending not to notice. When people asked vague questions, I answered vaguely. When they made assumptions, I didn't correct them. When people blamed confusion, I didn't offer clarity. I let uncertainty grow. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. It forces people to pay attention. Over the next few weeks, I noticed tension spreading through the family. Conversations became cautious. Side discussions increased. Trust started to fracture, not because of anything I said, but because of what people began to notice on their own. Contradictions, delays, explanations that didn't quite align. My uncle tried to regain control. He called meetings, offered reassurance, spoke about unity and patience. But once doubt enters a room, it doesn't leave easily. I watched him closely during one of those conversations, the way he avoided specifics, the way he redirected blame, the way he leaned on his reputation instead of facts. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. Not fear of being caught, fear of being questioned. That was the turning point, because questioning changes everything. People started asking for clarification, quietly at first, then more directly, not accusing, just curious. My uncle answered confidently, but each answer required more effort than the last. I didn't need to say a word. The final shift came during another family dinner, larger this time. Same table, same kind of laughter, but the atmosphere different. People listened more carefully, watched reactions, paid attention to who spoke and who stayed silent. The jokes felt forced. The confidence felt brittle. Halfway through the meal, someone brought up the issue again, gently, without names, just a question about transparency. The room went still.
My uncle responded, but this time his words didn't land the way they used to. Too polished, too rehearsed. I felt eyes turn toward me, not because I spoke, but because I didn't. Because I didn't rush to agree or smooth things over. Silence can feel accusatory when people expect reassurance. That's when I realized the balance had shifted completely. I was no longer invisible. I was the variable they couldn't predict. And as the conversation continued, slowly unraveling into something more honest and less controlled, I understood that the moment they finally found out who I really was wouldn't come with a dramatic reveal. It would come when they realized they'd been exposed by their own behavior, and that I'd been watching long enough to make sure they couldn't explain their way out of it anymore. That realization didn't hit them all at once. It arrived unevenly, settling into different people at different times. Some felt it as discomfort, others as suspicion, a few as quiet panic. What connected all of it was uncertainty. No one knew who still believed what, or who might speak up next.
My uncle tried to regain his footing by becoming more involved, too involved. He started checking in more often, asking questions he'd never bothered to ask before, offering help that felt unnecessary. It was his way of reasserting relevance, of reminding everyone who he thought he was. I noticed how people responded: shorter answers, less enthusiasm, polite distance. Trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly, it erodes. One evening, I overheard my parents talking in the other room. They didn't know I was listening. They were careful with their voices, but I could hear the tension underneath. My uncle had called again, another explanation, another reassurance, another request for patience. My mom said something that stuck with me. "Why does it feel like we're always being asked to wait?" That was the first time I'd heard doubt spoken out loud. I didn't interrupt. I didn't step in. That wasn't my role. Not yet. People need to arrive at the truth themselves, or they'll always look for a way to leave it behind later. At the next gathering, the dynamic was unmistakably different. Conversations overlapped awkwardly, people second-guessed their words. Someone brought up accountability, not directly, but enough to shift the room. No one laughed it off. My uncle responded the only way he knew how. He spoke longer, he over-explained, he leaned on his past contributions like proof that the present didn't need examining. That's when I saw it clearly. He wasn't defending the truth anymore, he was defending his position. And positions are fragile when they're built on assumption. I caught his eye across the table, just for a moment. There was no challenge in my expression, no accusation, just attention. He looked away first. Later that night, he pulled me aside, not dramatically, casually, like it was an afterthought. "You've been quiet," he said again. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" I shrugged. "About how things change." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They do," he said. "That's life." I met his gaze. Only when people let them. For a second, he looked like he might say something else. Then he laughed it off and patted my shoulder, the way adults do when they want to end a conversation without giving anything away. But I had given him something he didn't expect: uncertainty. After that, the calls slowed down, the explanations became shorter, the confidence thinned. People started speaking to each other directly, instead of through him. Questions that had once been redirected now landed where they were meant to. I watched the family recalibrate in real time. One afternoon, a relative asked me what I thought about everything. It wasn't framed as a test, it was genuine curiosity. That alone told me how much had changed. "I think," I said carefully, "that people usually show you who they are when they think no one's paying attention." They nodded slowly, like they were filing that away. That night, my uncle didn't join the group conversation. He stayed on the edge, listening more than speaking. For the first time, he was the one being read. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. Authority that relies on silence collapses when silence stops protecting it. I didn't expose him. I didn't accuse him. I didn't reveal anything new. I let the truth he'd been living with finally catch up to him. Eventually, someone else said what needed to be said. Not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. They asked for transparency, for clarity, for answers that didn't depend on trust alone. My uncle tried to respond, but his words tangled. Too many explanations layered over each other. Too much effort. And suddenly, everyone could see it. The betrayal wasn't just about what he'd done. It was about how long he assumed no one would notice. The conversation ended without resolution. No shouting, no confrontation, just a quiet understanding that things couldn't go along the same way. As people started to leave, my uncle lingered. He looked tired, smaller somehow. He didn't look at me when he spoke, but I knew the words were meant for me. "I didn't think it would matter," he said. "You were just there." I considered that. Then I replied, "That's usually when it matters most." He didn't have an answer. After that, distance set in naturally. He stopped calling as often, stopped offering explanations, stopped trying to control the narrative. Others stepped in to handle what he once dominated. Nothing was announced, no sides were declared, but the balance had shifted completely. At home, my parents spoke more openly now, about boundaries, about trust, about how easy it is to confuse confidence with competence. They didn't ask me to explain myself. They didn't need to. They'd seen enough. One evening, my dad said something quietly as we were cleaning up after dinner. You handled all of that well."
I didn't respond right away. Then I said, "I didn't do much." He shook his head. "You did exactly enough." That stayed with me. I realized then that revenge doesn't have to look like victory. It can look like correction, like balance being restored, like someone losing the power they never should have had in the first place. And as weeks passed, it became clear that the story people told themselves about me had changed too. I wasn't just the kid at the end of the table anymore. I was someone who noticed, someone who remembered, someone who didn't rush to speak, but didn't miss anything either. That awareness followed me everywhere, in conversations, in silence, in the way people measured their words around me now. They had found out who I really was, not because I told them, but because they finally had to look. And as I thought about how quietly everything had turned, I knew the final part of this story wouldn't be about what they lost. It would be about what I gained by letting them believe, for as long as they did, that I was just a kid. What I gained wasn't control or leverage or the satisfaction people imagine comes with being right. It was something quieter than that, something steadier, clarity. Once the balance shifted, nothing rushed back into place. There were no sudden apologies, no dramatic admissions, just a slow reorganization of trust. Conversations changed shape, decisions were made more carefully. People stopped assuming and started checking. My uncle faded into the background without anyone needing to push him there, not punished, not exposed publicly, just no longer centered. Authority returned to where it belonged, shared instead of hoarded. That was the real consequence. At the next family gathering, the table felt different. The same chairs, the same dishes, but the energy had changed. People listened to each other. Interruptions were fewer. When questions came up, they were answered plainly or postponed honestly instead of being wrapped in confidence. My uncle showed up late and left early. He was polite, reserved, careful. No speeches, no explanations. He didn't look at me much anymore. I didn't need him to. Someone asked me a question directly that night, about plans, about opinions. They waited for my answer. No one laughed, no one rushed past it. I answered calmly. That was new. On the drive home, my mom glanced at me and smiled slightly. "You know," she said, "people see you differently now." I nodded. I know. Not with pride, just awareness. Over time, that awareness became part of how I moved through the world. I didn't rush to correct people when they underestimated me. I didn't rush to prove anything either. I understood now that being underestimated can be a position of strength if you know how to use it. What surprised me most was how little I felt afterward. No rush, no lingering anger, just a sense of alignment, like something that had been off for a long time had finally settled. The betrayal still existed, it always would, but it no longer defined the space. It had been absorbed, examined, and corrected without me having to become someone I didn't recognize. That mattered. Weeks later, I ran into my uncle alone for the first time since everything had shifted. It was brief, awkward. He nodded at me, said my name, and paused like he might say more. He didn't. Neither did I. Some conversations don't need to happen to be finished. As months passed, the story of what happened changed depending on who told it. Some softened it, some ignored it entirely, a few framed it as a misunderstanding that resolved itself. I let them. The truth didn't need a narrator anymore. What stayed consistent was the lesson, not spoken out loud, but understood. People watched what they said more closely, paid attention to who was in the room, considered the weight of silence, and I carried that lesson with me beyond family dinners, beyond that table, into every space where people assume they know who you are before you speak. I learned that secrets don't survive attention, that betrayal often hides behind familiarity, and that revenge doesn't have to destroy to be complete. Sometimes it just removes the illusion of control. I still sit quietly sometimes, still listen more than I talk, not because I'm unsure, but because I know what listening gives you. It gives you the whole picture, not just the part people perform. Looking back,
I realize how close I came to breaking that night, to speaking too soon, to defending myself before there was space for the truth to breathe. If I had, everything would have turned into noise, sides would have formed, the real issue would have been buried under reactions. Instead, I waited, and in waiting, I let people show exactly who they were. That's what changed everything. Not the moment they realized I wasn't just a kid, but the moment they realized I never had been, and that I had seen them clearly the entire time. Some people lose power when they're exposed, others lose it when they're understood, and that's a much quieter ending, one that lasts.